Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we're bringing back Mark Erikson. Mark, how you doing?
Doing pretty good.
Good. I'm super happy to have you back on the show. It is always an absolute pleasure to have the chance to talk to you. So for folks who aren't familiar with you and your work, do you want to give us a bit of a background on who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my day job currently is working at replay.io, where we're building a true time-traveling debugger for JavaScript. My free time, such as it is spent maintaining Redux and answering questions about React and Redux and everything else.
Yeah. And so Redux, actually, you know what? Let's hold off a second before we talk about that. So you, we were talking a little bit before the show started, and we were just kind of reflecting on the state of communities and how the React community is such a perceived enormous community, right? Like there are thousands, if not millions, of people who have tried React, and tens of thousands of us are shipping it to production, and all that leads to the perception that like React must be this huge and well-maintained and thriving maintenance community. But when you start kind of scratching at the surface and digging down, you realize that it's like you.
Well, I mean, like lots of other people, but it's. I mean, I've seen suggestions that like for any given major website, you've got like 10% of people who actively participate, and 90% just read.
Right.
1% who are like the core content creators or like actively involved. And so like when you break down the numbers, it's always a very small percentage of people who are doing the work, whether the work is like just discussion or actively moderating, developing, building, contributing. I mean, it's just law of numbers. Right.
And so the reason that I was thinking about this is because you had mentioned that the React subreddit, which in my mind is one of the bigger, more active ones, is down to a single moderator, which is you. And then how big is and Redux? So let's talk about Redux for a quick second. So Redux is one of the early React ecosystem libraries, and it's also one of the most prolific by a pretty healthy margin. It's in so many projects. How many maintainers are there on core maintainers are there on the Redux project?
Okay, so let's actually go chronologically on that one. So Dan and Andrew created Redux in the summer of 2015, launched it 1.0 a couple months later. I got involved in the beginning of 2016 when I volunteered to write an FAQ page. Dan had gotten hired by Facebook to work on React in November 2015. By summer 2016, so just 1 year after Redux came out, Dan was very busy working on React, and so he effectively handed over the maintainer keys to myself and a guy named Tim Dorr, who was already very active working on React Router alongside Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence. So at that point, there's basically two maintainers, myself and Tim. I've never met Tim. We've talked back and forth, but Tim is very much a let's leave this the way it is kind of a guy. Like a maintenance maintainer, which is a totally fine point of view. So I fell into being the person who was doing the active discussion and trying to work on some releases and whatnot. In 2018, when we were working on Redux Toolkit, a number of folks chipped in and helped out in various ways, working on a few of the features, doing the initial conversion from JavaScript to TypeScript, etc. The real big change came, and I think it was early 2019, when Lenz Weber, GitHub handle Franius, joined to start improving the TypeScript support. And at the time, I actually barely knew TypeScript myself. So he was filing these PRs to improve our TypeScript setup, and I actually couldn't even really review them properly. So he was, in essence, having to teach me TypeScript better so that I could review the PRs he was filing. I actually still remember the first PR that I filed just to improve the types, and I was trying to use a TypeScript conditional expression for the first time, and he was flipping it around and like reviewing me and trying to guide me through the process. So at some point, it's like, you're doing great stuff here. You should totally just be a maintainer. So we added Lens officially in mid 2019. He proceeded to go on and build out a lot of our like the types for create slice and create async thunk and things like that. We had a couple other people who were chipping in and doing some docs work, general reviews. Matt Sikowski, someone whose GitHub handle is Shrugsy, that I've never met. And then sometime last year, there was a guy who'd been hanging around in the Redux channel on Discord, whose handle was Eskimo Joe. I believe his name is Ben Durant. And he's been very, very active answering questions for the last couple of years. And he had started filing a few PRs like 6 months ago to tweak a few different things. And so like 3 or 4 months ago, we decided to invite him into the Discord maintainers ongoing chat DM that we've got. That was an excellent decision because the floodgates open and he just started filing like dozens of PRs ranging from little tweaks to like entire new features. And so most of the stuff that's in the last couple alphas and betas we put out was actually done by Ben.
Oh, cool.
So
okay. Ben just arrived in the chat, by the way. Thank you. Hello, Ben.
Nice. So at this point, we've got effectively 2.5 active maintainers. Lens is very much involved, but he's busy with day job stuff, working at Apollo and various personal life things. So he's active in the discussions. He hasn't had much time to work on code lately. I've been doing a lot of the infrastructure work in the last few months. Ben has been doing a lot of the code changes recently. So let's call it 3 active maintainers and another 3 folks who kind of hang around, discuss, and chip in. I should also mention his handle is Methuselah. I know him. I can't think of his real name right now, but he maintains the Redux dev tools, and he's also done a number of types tweaks for both the Redux core and Redux Toolkit over the last year or so to try to prepare us for an upgrade.
Cool. Yeah. So I think something that strikes me is that for a package that has, hold on, let me just find npm trends, and let's look at Redux here for a second. And the Redux package is downloaded roughly 8.8 million times per day over the last month or so, according to this.
Day or month?
I don't know. How does this work? I'll just show this for a second. This is the trend or the chart I'm looking at. I don't know if that's daily downloads or average monthly.
So that's I think does that say year over there?
This says downloads over the past 1 year, but then it has like date, like specific days. So this is saying like March 26, 9.3 million. And I don't know if that's averaged over the last 30 days or if that's per day. But either way, it's an enormous amount of downloads. I mean, like let's add React here, and so Redux is downloaded roughly half as often as React. So that's wild. That is really wild to think about, because for you to be able to give a full chronological history of everybody who maintains this project actively, and it boils down to roughly, what, 8 or 9 people through time, that's... It really does just show how much of the tools that we work with are actively driven by a very small and dedicated group. You had mentioned that XKCD of what is it? XKCD Nebraska.
Nebraska, yeah.
This one is a good little good little reminder of just how wild it is out there. And yeah, so I think this is, and let me share this this trends chart as well. But that it's just really interesting to me how much of our code landscape that we would, we just think like, oh, well, Redux is just there, it just exists. But it's it's actively maintained by a very small group, and you're all volunteers. Like nobody gets paid to work on Redux. Is that correct? Or I guess you have a open collective or something.
Each of us has set up GitHub sponsors, but
Okay.
it's basically like coffee and dinner money,
Right.
not like we're actually like making money off this kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. It's not, you're not quitting your day job.
Oh, no, definitely not. One, because I love working at Replay, but also because no, it's small donations, not like real job money at all.
Yeah, that, and so anyways, this isn't, I realize I'm veering toward like lecturing on the importance of supporting open source, which I do think we should be supporting open source more than we are. But I also think what you just said is also very interesting, because you ran this chronology from 2015 to today of Redux, and along the way you were mentioning these big shifts that have happened. And I know that when I worked with Redux, I was definitely using like the 2015 version of Redux. I had, a fairly like, the high boilerplate Redux with thunks and sagas and the sort of big. I think what has given people the impression that Redux is very complicated, and a lot of that comes down to this perception that like you need a lot of boilerplate, you need a lot of external plugins and dependencies to make Redux function the way that you need it to. But it's been going on like what 8 years now, and a lot has changed. And so you were on the show a little while back, and we talked about modern Redux.
2 years.
God, 2 years. And that episode actually, let me switch back to this view, because this was a fun little moment for me. We crossed 100,000 views on this episode. So let me share this with the chat. And so 2 years ago, we did this episode, and let me pause that. We'll open it up in YouTube here. And 101,000 views. So this is
Nice.
the first video, the first episode of Learn with Jason that crossed 100,000 views on YouTube. So thank you to everybody who's watched it. But it's also like, what a strong signal that Redux is very active in the landscape and very influential. Like we're doing a lot with Redux out there in React land today. But so I brought that up because the Redux landscape has shifted significantly, and not all of us have learned the new ways of using Redux. I think there's a lot of really popular educational material out there still using older approaches. There are, courses and tutorials that were launched in 2016, 2017 that are still going strong, teaching people Redux that's 5-6 years out of date now.
Or even worse, relatively new tutorials. There was one Udemy course in particular that was extremely popular that kept advertising like updated with hooks, updated with Redux or whatever, and it was still showing like years old patterns, or for that matter, like free code camps Redux section was, the last time I looked, still showing the original legacy patterns. I don't know if they've finally gotten around to updating that, but it is very frustrating for us as maintainers to see people coming in with questions, and it's clear that the learning resources they're looking at are years out of date.
Mm-hmm.
And either they're looking at something that was just very old and never updated, or they're looking at something that's new that's still not reflecting the patterns that we've been teaching as a default for 3+ years now.
Sure.
And we see this all the time, even today.
Okay. And that is why I wanted to have you on today, because the last time you were here about Redux, we talked about RTK, Redux Toolkit, and some of the modern methods. And I'll be honest, it kind of blew my mind how different it felt compared to the Redux that I worked with in 2016 at IBM. And so now, 2 years later, I kind of want to talk about it again. Like, RTK's been out for a little while now. There's big shifts. There was, I know, a move to like update, even deprecate some core APIs, and that's caused a lot of discussion. And yeah, I see your eyebrow go up because I got to see some of the discussion around that. But yeah, it is just wild to me how much the landscape has shifted, right? So with that in mind, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's new in Redux in 2023, and see if we can help maybe set the record straight for folks who haven't had access to like updated learning materials or courses. How should they be building today?
Sure. Let's do the chronological thing again. That's how my brain works. I roll through things in sequence. So we published RTK 1.0 in, I believe, October 2019. And I spent most of 2020 rewriting our core docs tutorials. I added this brand new essentials tutorial, which number one, teaches Redux Toolkit as the default standard way to use Redux. It's very focused on how to use it properly. And so it walks through building an entire application step by step. And along the way, it shows each of the primary pieces that are included in Redux Toolkit. But it's positioned as, okay, now we're going to add this next feature to the application. And oh, look, it just conveniently happens that the problem we need to solve is solved by this next piece in RTK. So it shows you how to create a store, how to create slices, how to read data in the components, dispatch actions, normalize state, do data fetching, and then later on, I eventually added a couple more pages that show how to use RTK query for the data fetching. So I also rewrote the kind of like the conceptual level tutorial. So there's also a fundamentals tutorial that has no abstractions and starts from the bare basic principles. It explains, what is a reducer, what are actions, how would you use a basic store, how would you write some of this data fetching code by hand, shows how and why patterns like action creators and thunks exist, and then finishes by showing, and here's how Redux Toolkit simplifies all of those.
Yeah.
So those tutorials came out in 2020, and that has been a really big shift in how we've been able to teach and have people learn Redux. Late 2020 is when Len started working on building this RTK query data fetching library. And so when I came on to do the video with you in spring of 2021, we had like an alpha or a beta of RTK query, and it worked. And we were in the process of shifting it from being a little like standalone temporary package to merging it into the real Redux Toolkit package and getting it ready for release. So we put that out in, I think, like June 2021, Redux Toolkit 1.6. And we've put out 3 more minor releases of RTK since then. 1.7 had a bunch of new options for RTK query. We also, one of the long-standing complaints about Redux Toolkit and Create Slice was that in the case where you had 2 different slices that needed to depend on actions from each other, you could end up with like a circular import problem.
Sure.
One of the files would initialize first, the other file would not have initialized yet, and you would get undefined errors because of module init problems. And Lens was able to come up with a very clever workaround for this, where it only creates the reducer on demand as it's accessed, and that delays it long enough that it basically solved that circular import problem. I know that there were some folks who were afraid to use Redux Toolkit because of that concern, and we were able to solve it. Let's see, Redux Toolkit 1.8, we shipped a new side effects middleware that we call listeners. So early in like the first couple of years of Redux, everybody was building their own side effects add-ons. Like, do you want to use generator functions or RxJS or promises or functions, and like dozens of different add-on libraries. And eventually it settled down into Redux Saga, Redux Observable, and Redux Thunk. So basically your choice of generators or RxJS or plain functions. And we built Thunks into Redux Toolkit, but there were still a lot of people using Sagas or Observables, which are kind of heavy and complicated. So we wanted to build in a simpler way to write reactive style logic, but using async await as the base concept, kind of like Thunks, but they can respond to an action that's been dispatched.
Okay.
And so we shipped that in 1.8, and it's been very, very well received. Frankly, better than I even thought it would be.
Always the
best. A lot of folks, yeah, like a lot of folks have been using Sagas or Observables, and they switched over. It's like, oh, this is so much easier to use than those. And then we shipped 1.9, which was a bunch more RTK query performance optimizations and options tweaks. We also shipped a new add-on that tries to, if it's turned on, it can cut down on the number of times the store notifies the UI that something has changed. Actually kind of inspired by how React batches updates together so that it can improve UI update performance if you've got the right pieces in place. Along with that, we've had some changes to the other libraries. We shipped React Redux version 8, I believe, early in 2022. And that had two big changes. One is that we migrated the library itself to be written in TypeScript. Previously, it was plain JavaScript, and the type definitions were maintained by the community. We also changed the internal subscription logic to work with the new use sync external store hook that is in React itself, which frankly was like almost a direct copy of what React Redux used to do. And the React team added this primitive to React itself so that libraries like Redux could work better with React's concurrent rendering stuff. And in fact, we had a lot of talks with the React team about like, what does it do right now? How does it need to work? Andrew Clark went off and built the first prototype. And then I simultaneously was building the first proof of concept PR that used this new hook and giving them feedback saying, well, it doesn't cover this case, ran into this problem. And so we were alpha testing it so that the rest of the community could benefit from that new behavior. With the idea is like, if it works for React Redux, it ought to work for Zeustend and everybody else.
Nice. Okay, cool.
Let's see, I shipped late 2021. I took over as the maintainer for the Reselect memoization library. Merged in a bunch of type updates that someone had done, added some new options to selectors for things like cache size and comparisons. And then there's the one that we were alluding to a few minutes ago, which is in April of last year, I shipped Redux 4.2.0, where I officially deprecated the old style createStore API, and many people yelled at me because of this.
Yeah, I got a chance to see some of that discussion, and I lack the patience that you have for that. Like I've quit jobs over one or two annoying coworkers. I don't know how you are able to stand up to so much anonymous abuse from people saying like, oh, your ideas are bad, or this is terrible, or you're ruining everything, or what, you know. It's just like this kind of stream of people being grumpy all the time.
Like even just within the last 2 weeks, I was at the conference. I was at the React Summit conference last week. I had an amazing day Thursday, and I got back to my hotel room, and someone had left a comment on one of those issue threads, complaining about us deprecating createStore. Now, to be fair, this was at least the politest comment that anyone had left on that topic, and they actually like rationally said, here's why this bothers me, and here's what I wish you'd done instead. But it was yet another example where they had ignored the many, many reasons why I had explained all the reasons, the purpose of this change. Had another couple complaints on, it was either Reddit or an issue like a day or two later. Literally just last night, someone popped into like a pair of 2-year-old Reddit threads and left comments that I replying directly to me, specifically insulting Redux and the Redux team and telling us how awful we are. Honestly, those I can deal with. It's the repeated complaints about deprecating createStore that bother me. Both because, like, for a lot of reasons. One is that people assume we don't know what we're doing, or accuse us of not knowing what we're doing, or I can even understand people who disagree with it at the technical level. I don't want to use immer for state updates or something like that, or extra bundle size. I disagree, but I can understand those points. It's the people who accuse us of doing this in bad faith, or like, you just want people to use the library you wrote, not the one Dan Abramov wrote. It's like, Dan only maintained this library for 1 year. I've been doing it for 8 years. I published all the last umpteen releases of all our libraries. Do I not have the right to say how this should be used?
Right. Yeah, I think that's sort of there's a fascinating and somewhat unhealthy relationship with hero worship in the React community that leads to, I don't know, it's very odd to me that there are some folks who just sort of have like blessed opinions. They can say whatever they want and everybody's like, yes, that's correct. And then the fallout of that is exactly what you're talking about. If a maintainer who's very well known says a thing in 2015, time will pass, opinions will change, but that maintainer's not there anymore. And so people will act like that maintainer still believes the thing, even if they just aren't working on that thing anymore. And it leads to very like dogmatic arguments instead of pragmatic arguments. And ultimately what we need to be striving for as a community is pragmatism. Like, we're all trying to get work done. We're all trying to get websites up onto the internet in the least painful, most maintainable, least likely to break way, right? And to say like you've changed this in a way that goes against this old statement is not really, that's not like a pragmatic way of looking at it. Like, you've changed this in a way that broke my workflow because of XYZ. That's a discussion we can have, right? Because then it's based in facts and in goals and what we're trying to accomplish. You broke it because you disagreed with somebody from 10 years ago as like, I don't know, but that doesn't feel like an argument we can really have productively.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on this topic. I'll try to keep them short. One is that libraries and tools and needs and use cases evolve. Look at React itself. The React that came out in 2013 is drastically different than the React that we have today. The core concepts are the same. You're still writing components that have props and state and re-render, but the syntax and the usage patterns are drastically different. And that's because people have used the library in different ways. People have expressed the needs to do things that were not originally anticipated. The core team has a vision for how it should be used and is trying to both respond to user feedback and evolve the library to solve what they think are the important problems. And Redux is the same way. The original vision and ideas that Dan and Andrew had in 2015 are still the core of Redux. It's still a single store. You're writing reducers that do immutable updates in response to dispatched actions and selecting data into components. But the syntax and the approaches and the pieces that we've built are directly designed to solve the problems that people ran into with Redux and the apps that they were trying to build with Redux. The flip side of this is, and this is going to the hero worship point, and I want to be very careful in how I say this because I'm not trying to critique or lash out at anybody. Everybody on the React core team has at some point publicly stated in the last few years how much they dislike Redux or think it's outdated or should not be used. Andrew, Dan, Brian Vaughn, Sebastian to some extent. And they are absolutely entitled to have their opinions. They are allowed to state it publicly. It is like, I am not trying to say they can't have those opinions or state them. At the same time, it makes my job very, very difficult because they are very visible. They have very high profiles. Everybody sees those comments, and they ricochet and fly around everywhere. They get a ton of responses, and people cite them for years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there are specific tweets I can think of from each of those people that still get thrown at us or used in like Reddit comments where someone's like, well, you know, Andrew once said that Redux is awful, or, you know, Dan said in that mock interview he did with a YouTuber a couple years ago that he would almost never use Redux, or Dan once tweeted that he looks back at Redux code and finds it confusing. People cite these endlessly. And again, like it was a valid thing for Dan to say. But it's not just because Dan had an opinion and said something once does not mean that nobody should ever consider using this tool. People don't think for themselves.
I think, Mark, I'm listening to you say this, and I'm realizing that I'm more petty than I thought I was, because if somebody came in and told me you're ruining the library that Dan wrote, I would just post the tweet of Dan saying not to use it and be like, there's your answer. Bye.
Yep.
Lock the thread.
All right. We've hit one of my own hot buttons enough. Let's move on to more productive discussions.
Good call. Good call. No, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about. So one of the things that I found. Well, actually, I feel like you had a list that you wanted to go through, and so I want to hand that back to you so that you can go through your list, because I want to make sure we have time.
Okay. Let's talk about migrating to Redux Toolkit for a few minutes. So early on, the only real documentation for doing this was the last page in the fundamentals tutorial, which does explicitly show, like, here's the app we've been building up using the old handwritten style patterns, and now we can migrate it to Redux Toolkit step by step. So I did actually add a new usage guide page about 6 months ago that is explicitly instructions on how to migrate. So it talks about, like, you know, for example, old style code and new style Redux Toolkit code can coexist. You can do this migration very incrementally, piece by piece. The normal process that we recommend is start by switching over the store setup to use configure store. It's a one-time thing, and it'll simplify that one file, you know, probably knock off like 20 or 30 lines of copy paste setup, but it also adds the development mode checks for things like, you know, accidentally mutating state or putting non-serializable values in the store. So it's a good place to start with the process. And all your old existing code still works just fine. It doesn't matter whether you wrote the reducers as a bunch of switch statements or create slice. It's all just Redux code. It all still works. But then you can pick like one slice reducer at a time and replace that and the associated actions and action creators with create slice. Plug that in, and then just continue doing one of these at a time, piece by piece. And so this page goes through and it says, for each of the different like kinds of logic that you could have in an application, here is how you would migrate that code to the equivalent modern looking code with create slice or RTK query for data fetching, or, you know, switching from sagas or observables to the RTK listener middleware. And so I hope this is a useful guide that will help people do this. And I've migrated 2 or 3 different Redux projects to use RTK myself. In fact, this is what I spent most of 2022 doing at Replay. So I can very much vouch that this is entirely feasible. We've also got a introduction section docs page called Why RTK is How to Use Redux Today. And it goes through some of that, discussion of like, what were the problems? Why did we create RTK? Why should you be using this? So it's more of the background information on this.
Got it. Yeah. And so, and this is, well, actually, maybe you've kind of touched on it, but if you could sum it up in a couple of sentences, why is RTK the way to use Redux today?
Multiple reasons. So it was designed to simplify and standardize basically all the common usage patterns that people were doing already with Redux. Mm-hmm. What do you do with Redux? You write reducers that respond to actions and create immutably updated state. They need to care about an action type string. They usually have an action creator function that you use to do the dispatching. Create slice does all that by letting you write it without switch statements, using immer for simpler immutable update logic that also happens to eliminate accidental mutations, and it generates your action creators for free. You typically did data fetching by writing a thunk that would dispatch actions before and after the request, create async thunk, makes all those actions, does the dispatching for you. You just make the request and return the value. Or even better, RTK query lets you just say, hey, I want to fetch get Pokemon, and it generates all the caching logic for you, gives you the hooks, and manages the cache lifecycle so that the data gets removed when your components no longer need it. People were writing reactive logic with sagas and observables, but it was really complicated. So we've got the listener middleware that lets you do the same thing with simpler syntax, smaller bundle size, and better TS support. And like, I think the standardization is a really important thing. People, up through 2018, I was maintaining a list of all the Redux-related packages and add-ons that I saw in the ecosystem. And there were literally thousands of them, and many of them duplicate of each other. Mm-hmm. And that's not counting like the homegrown abstractions that people had in their own repositories at work. And so every Redux project ended up looking somewhat different. And so by providing a standard set of tools and opinionated recommendations on like, you use a feature folder structure, put your logic in the slice files, it really helps make these projects hopefully look and feel a lot more common, so you can go between them and actually have a better idea where everything lives and how it works.
This is something that I've noticed as I've kind of gone through my career is there tends to be this kind of big divide between providing a library that is only primitives and saying, you're smart, you'll figure it out, and providing a library that says, look, I'm going to give you a few rules, and those rules are going to mean that you can exchange ideas more readily because things look similar and like are somewhat conforming to a spec, right? And I've noticed that React in general tends to lean, like React, the core team tends to lean primitives. They hand you a tool and they say, this is really powerful. We don't care how you use it. Like they're kind of anti-file structure, like, oh, just put it all in one file. Like they're not into telling you how to organize things. And like I said, that's a philosophy. And you felt that in early Redux days. It was very much like, here's the boilerplate to like make this thing work, and it's 4 files, and then like do whatever you want after that. And it's just going to be whatever you need it to be. And I experienced that very much when I was at IBM, because we had Redux in production, but I've never seen a Redux implementation that looks like that Redux implementation. Like everything about it was bespoke. There were tons of little things that we had hand rolled, and we had thunks, but we'd wrapped those in something else so that they weren't really thunks anymore. And like, you could kind of see we're not quite sure what the like convention is for this, so we're just going to make something up, and then it's no longer a thing that's like, I actually think this is at the root of why people struggle with Redux sometimes, is because their first experience with it was that it had no resemblance to any other Redux they'd ever seen. I think the same thing happened to Webpack. Like Webpack was like, here's these primitives, build plugins, and everybody built whatever plugins they wanted, and they were all very bespoke, very idiosyncratic, and we all just kind of ended up saying like, oh, well, Webpack is hard, but it's not. It was all the ecosystem stuff because there weren't any rules that made it really hard. And I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift away from that with like folder-based routing and these frameworks kind of imposing these rules, right? You must put files here. They need this use client or use server. You need to add like this suffix or this prefix or whatever it is to make this thing function. And that gives us predictability. It gives us rules. It gives us structure. And now when you move between projects, you kind of know what to expect. Like when you open up a Remix project or a Svelte project, you kind of know where things are because that's where they have to be or else the project doesn't work unless somebody goes way out of their way to write custom config that changes folder structures and stuff. And I'm just seeing a lot less of that now because the conventions make sense. It makes things portable and usable and easable, or more easy. And all of that coming back around to say, it feels like that's what's happening in Redux with the Redux Toolkit setup is we're applying all of the knowledge of the last 7-8 years and saying, if you do it like this, you're going to get the best results. And yes, we realize that's going to cause you to maybe move some of your cheese and change some of the ways that you name things or where you want to put files. But if you do it like this, Redux projects will look like Redux projects and they'll be portable and you can share knowledge and code because it all looks and works the same.
Yeah, so I mean, the elevator version of all that is RTK takes all the things that you've normally done with Redux. We provide APIs that simplify most of those patterns, help you avoid common mistakes one way or another, and it's like all the stuff we've learned about how to use Redux built in.
Yeah. Well, cool. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So I am definitely, I think, somebody who would have maybe 5-10 years ago said, don't give me rules, like quit telling me where to put my files. And I've very much about faced on that. Like I really am a big fan now of like convention. There's a line, obviously. Like I've used some projects where, you know, you have to create 5 files to create one new thing. And I'm kind of like, hey, that's a little too much convention for me. But I like the idea of pages go here, utilities go here, you know, data fetching goes here. Like if I know where things are, then when I get a new project, I can go look and see how things are done. And I don't have to like make my own mental map. I already know how the project is constructed. So yeah, that's great. And I am very on board with that. Did you have any other like bullet points on this or do you want to move on to the next point?
Well, let's actually tie in one of the next items, which
let's do it.
Deprecating createStore. Can you pull up the release notes for Redux 4.2?
Yes. Let's go to
there should be a link in the guest actually.
A link.
Okay, yeah. If you let's see, or from here, go to releases and scroll down to past the betas, past the alphas. Keep going, keep going, and it's might be on the next page by now. Okay, yeah. Go ahead and pull up this one specifically. So this ties back to the points that we were making earlier, where there is a ton, like people today in 2023 are still learning Redux using very outdated material. Either they've run across a Medium post for 2017, or they're looking at a course that claims to be updated, but really just slapped a thin layer of like how to use hooks as a last chapter or something. Or they're looking at, you know, Free Code Camp, whose tutorial is out of date, or they're learning from a boot camp that hasn't changed the curriculum in the last 3 or 4 years, and they're getting like 8 weeks of JavaScript, 4 weeks of React, 4 weeks of Redux, go. And what we found is that, you know, these people have no idea that Redux Toolkit exists. They are not going to look at our docs at all because they don't know, they don't know to look at docs. It's not a thing that occurs to them, or they assume that every package has really bad docs and just rule it out completely. Kind of learned that one the hard way, that's how people respond to this. No one's going to tell them that Redux Toolkit exists. And they're just following instructions to npm install Redux, import createStore, write a reducer by hand. We don't have a way to reach out to those people proactively and communicate other than publishing the package itself. And
Right.
so early last year, I had filed an issue saying, you know, maybe we should mark createStore as deprecated just to give people like a visual signal about this. And the issue sat around for a couple months. And then I think I tweeted something about it in like March or early April. And this is where people began to yell at me. There is a very small but very, very vocal minority of hardcore old school Redux users who didn't like the fact that we wanted them to use Redux Toolkit. They didn't, want to have a bigger bundle size. They didn't like the idea of Immer, or they were accusing us of doing it in bad faith. And if you look at the original issue I filed and some of the follow-up discussions in our issues and on Reddit and on Twitter, people were, again, a very, very small but vocal group yelling at us and insisting that we were wrong. We could not do this. We were, breaking things. Like it was very frustrating. One of the most frustrating sets of conversations I've had. So the thing is, it actually encouraged me to do it. So I was actually sitting in the back row at the React Miami conference last year, and I was like, let's do this. Open up the repo, made a new branch, slapped the deprecated tag on createStore, checked it out, and published it. And if you look at these release notes, I am very careful to explain, here's why we are doing this, and here are the implications. So why are we doing this? Because people are learning Redux. They do not know that Redux Toolkit exists. We want to let them know that RTK exists. We want to point them to the documentation explaining why it exists. And we want to encourage them to switch over to using Redux Toolkit as a default. And it's like when you're writing Redux, like old school Redux code by hand, like createStore is actually the only Redux specific API. I mean, yeah, there's apply middleware and compose, but like there is no Redux method for defining a reducer. That's just a function that you wrote.
That was like the whole mystery of Redux, was that you would ask, how do I use Redux? And everybody was kind of like, well, Redux is a pattern more than a library. Like early days, right? You just got told, well, yeah, you do set this boilerplate up, and then after that, you're on your own.
Yep. So when we say we deprecate createStore, it's literally we want you to switch to using ConfigureStore from RTK instead, but it's also the whole Redux Toolkit library that we want you to look at and become aware of and start using. And all I did here was I added a JS.deprecated attribute. And the result is that when you import this into your editor, there's now just a little visual strike through on that import. And the goal is that a beginner would look at that, be confused, hover over it, and see the doc tooltip that says createStore is deprecated. We want you to use Redux Toolkit. Here is a link to that documentation page explaining more details. Now you'll note I did not add a runtime warning. I did not break anything. And in fact, in the upcoming Redux version 5, I would be within my rights in a major version to literally remove createStore as a method entirely. That's a breaking change. I can do those in major versions, right? No, we did not do any of those. We are not breaking anything. We are not putting out warnings. We are just trying to notify people that Redux Toolkit exists. Now, if they still choose to keep using old school Redux by hand, that's their choice. But at least we have made them aware that it exists.
Well, and I saw that you even
make that decision.
You introduced a way to turn off the deprecation notice by explicitly opting in to using the deprecated behavior.
Yeah. So if you scroll down here, it says if you don't like the strike through, there are 3 options. Option 1, you can just ignore it. It's a strike through. It does. Let's see. I think right below that screenshot. Option 1, you can ignore it. It does, like, it's just a visual. It does nothing. Option 2, you can switch to the aliased import, which does not have the deprecated tag. It's literally the exact same function, just different Java doc. Or you can actually switch to Redux Toolkit. And it's been effective. I've seen a number of people say, oh, I looked at this and then I followed the instructions and I updated. It also still continues to be an annoying source of controversy. There's, in addition to comments on our issues and whatnot, there's like one specific Stack Overflow thread where like the first person who asked about this after I published the release, I replied and explained the reasoning and linked to the docs. And if you look at the comments in response to my answer, just every couple months, someone else comes in and yells at me again and again and again.
So much patience that I lack. I would be bringing strong per my last email energy to every one of those replies.
Well, there is a bit of that. Like if you look at the last comment that I wrote in one of the GitHub discussions last week, I wrote a very, very long, detailed response because that's what I do. But basically reiterating most of the points that I made in here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is something commendable because first, like, when you are convinced that you're making the right call and you're the maintainer of a library, like that is the decision that you can make as the core maintainers. And if the majority of the community is in favor of it, you can just say, this is the way things are. Like you can pin to an old version if you don't want this change. And the fact that you're willing to not do that, that you're willing to continue to release this API, that you're giving an opt-out with legacy createStore, that you're only deprecating and not throwing runtime notices or ESLint errors or any of those things that would be a blocker to people. That to me shows a level of consideration that's often not present in software. A lot of open source feels more like, hey, it's free software. You got to deal with whatever we want to do here. And this feels a little more considerate and thoughtful than that.
Backwards compatibility and literally maintaining the ecosystem are some of my highest concerns as a maintainer. Because it's such a widely used set of packages. Like every decision I make has to take into account, how is this going to affect users? How much churn is there going to be? Is it worth any of that? And we'll talk about the new upcoming majors here in a minute, and those same factors go in. Like they're major versions. We could make breaking changes. We are making breaking changes, but even for those, like how much of an impact is it going to be? How hard is it going to be for our users to update? Is it worth the effort that we would, that we're going to put people through?
Right.
So like in this case, even after we publish Redux version 5, people are still going to be looking at outdated tutorials and trying to npm install Redux and import createStore. If I remove it, those people would truly break and not be able to follow tutorials. There are people who are using the Redux core package by itself, either because they have older code bases or they don't want to use RTK. I would break them. There are people, Redux Toolkit still relies on the Redux core and createStore. Yeah, we could, like, a number of people have suggested that we could like deprecate the standalone Redux package, shift it over to be a new like @redux.js/core package or something like that. Even that would involve a lot of churn. We'd have to update documentation. We would now be spitting out like a deprecation warning for the entire package every time it gets installed. Is that worth it for our users? And my answer at this point is no, it's not. So I'm trying to do like literally like the smallest thing that I can possibly do to nudge people in the right direction without being a jerk and disrupting people's workflows.
That's right. And I think that's a lesson that we can all take home, right? Is like, there's a way to have strong opinions about software and to do our part in pushing it in the direction that we think is best for developers in the future of the web. And you could do that without being a jerk, without being pushy, without being rude. Like this is the energy that we should be bringing to these discussions, because we can feel things, we can believe things, we can push for things, but we shouldn't be doing that at the expense of other people, right? Like breaking the ecosystem to prove that you're right, or breaking the ecosystem because people are being mean to you. Like, it'll probably feel good for a second, but it'll feel pretty bad when everybody, because then you really get yelling. Like, people getting upset about moving their cheese is one thing. People getting upset because like their project just broke at work, whew, that's not a fun day.
So on that note, let's flip over and talk about the future, and then if we have a little time at the end, we can talk about a couple of the ongoing debate and comparison with versus other tools points.
Sure.
So for the last, oh my word, it's June already, 6 months. We've been working on the next major versions of all of the Redux packages, and so we've been doing alphas for the first half of the year. And last week, literally while I was at the airport on my way to React Summit, I published betas for Redux Core and Redux Toolkit. So let's look at these briefly. We actually converted the Redux core to TypeScript in 2019, and then it sat there for 4 years. Version 4 worked fine, and again, like we were concerned about churn with major versions, and like even just updating peer depths and everything could have been an issue, as well as like, okay, we update it, we migrated to TypeScript, like, did we accidentally break any types? Are there any types changes we should make? This all really needs to be a major version. So version 5 will have it is written in TypeScript, so all the types are generated from that. We do have a lot of tweaks to the types. For example, the types used to default to having what was referred to as an any action type. So it's a TS type that says this is an action object with a type string, but any other possible field is just any. We have no idea what's in this. And that made it simple to use, and all that existed long before the unknown keyword was even added to the TypeScript language. But it also made it very unsafe to use from a type safety perspective. So we've got this new unknown action type where it says that every field other than action.type is considered to be unknown. And so now you have, like, you need to do like a type guard check to verify, oh, it's really a to-do added action before you can safely access like the payload field or the meta field or something like that, so that you know what the correct type is. Similarly, like the middleware type definition now says that the things being passed through are unknown by default instead of any. The other really big thing with all of the packages has been the file format and ESM compatibility work. So we've shipped a mixture of CommonJS and ES module files for years, but the way you're supposed to define what your package exports has changed in the last 5 years. It used to be that you provided top-level keywords called module for like an ESM-like file, or main for a CommonJS-like file. Now you're supposed to provide a top-level exports keyword that has nested fields that can say, for this entry point, here's the types, the ESM file, the CommonJS file, and maybe something else. And that's actually needed in order for those to work correctly as ESM under Node.
You just wrote all this up, right? You wrote a post on how you're doing this.
I wrote 4,000 words of a blog post on the flight back from React Summit, and I still need to write the other half of that.
Gotcha. Yeah. So make sure that you are on the lookout for that if you publish packages, because I followed some of this discussion of you and a bunch of other maintainers just trying to untangle the mess of how do you export properly when you're setting up your package.json. And I got lost, and I need that post as well, because I don't know how to export packages today in a way that's actually compatible.
I have been begging for years for someone who actually knows what they're doing to write like a comprehensive, authoritative guide on how to publish packages correctly in 2022, 23, 24, etc. The couple people I would really like to do this are Jason Miller from Google and Preact, or Matusz Brzezinski, who works on a whole bunch of different packages. They are both experts in the field of publishing packages and file formats and all that kind of stuff. They've both written bits and pieces.
What's their...
Matusz's handle is Andarist, Andarist.
Andarist Rake, right?
Yes, yeah. Yep, there you go.
Oh, I was not even close on that spelling. Jeez, my apologies. And then this is Jason Miller here.
Like I've been specifically asking them to write an authoritative post, and neither has. Andreas prefers to like pop up in tweets and GitHub threads and tell you how you're doing it wrong. I have found a couple different repositories and places where people have tried to put up guides, and they're somewhat useful, but they're still not kind of like the comprehensive thing I've been picturing in my head. I will end up linking the resources I've found as part of the post that I'm writing. I still feel like I don't actually know what I'm doing here, and it's a semi-imposter syndrome, semi-humility kind of thing. In practice, I suspect that I'm probably like one of the 10% of the people who actually, 3% of people who actually mostly know what they're doing, but it still feels like I don't.
I think that's got to be the terrifying truth of all of this, is that all the people at the bleeding edge of this industry are literally making it up as they go along, and we're all just like, well, clearly they know what they're doing.
Yeah. So I am very, very carefully phrasing this blog post as, this is not an authoritative guide. This is a recap of what I've done and what I've tried and where I ended up. And I think it's useful, but please don't take this as like the defining set of things to do.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so the point is, I've managed to settle on a set of configurations that I'm now using in all of our packages, which I believe works correctly to say, here's the ESM files, here's the common.js files, and it seems to work in Webpack 4, Webpack 5, Node, Vite with ES build, etc. We've also modernized the JS output. We're no longer transpiling things for IE11. It's all like latest and greatest JavaScript syntax, including optional chaining. If you need something else, it's your job to transpile from Node modules for whatever your application needs. We are dropping UMD build files. I think these were primarily being used as like script tags for code pens and stuff like that. And, I don't have any real usage stats on this, but for the flip side is I am including a new file in each package that is an ES module with all the development production checks already compiled away and minified to production mode, so that you should be able to use it as a script type equals module, ES module in the browser for that same use case if you want to.
And that's got full compatibility with any modern browser.
Hopefully.
Your toes were off screen, but we got to assume those were crossed too.
Yeah. And then the rest of this is like relatively minor changes that are in theory breaking, but hopefully not. For example, we now require that the action.type field must be a string. 99.98% of the time it has in any practical application, and it definitely is if you're using Redux Toolkit. It was always an assumption we made. It was always something we encouraged people to do, but technically you could have used like a number or a symbol or something. And given that we think it's the right choice, especially because this is what gets shown in the Redux DevTools history list, but let's just make it that the actual requirement.
Right.
So if you flip over to the Redux Toolkit 2.0 beta release notes
here.
Let's see.
Wait, where was it?
go back. Did I have a bad link there? Maybe I had a bad link.
Well, that links to the 5.0 beta. Okay. So we'll go out to
that's my bad. I need to fix that link.
Toolkit.
Yep, Toolkit releases on the right, and then 2.0 beta should be the most recent.
There it is.
Okay, so this has the same kind of file format changes and some various TypeScript tweaks. We do have a number of let me find my own release notes here. 2.0 beta. We do have another of other similar type tweaks. Like we've improved some of the inference. You have to, if you're trying to provide like some custom middleware enhancers, you have to be a little more careful about how you provide them so the types get inferred correctly. We have removed some deprecated syntax and options. The biggest one is that originally you could provide some reducers as like an object where the keys were type strings, like to-dos / to-do added, or even passing in one of the action creator functions as the key, because that would get implicitly stringified. And it worked, and it was kind of cute and nice for early adoption, but it works really badly for TypeScript. TypeScript has no idea what the TS type of the action object is supposed to be. So we later came up with a builder callback syntax that does correct type inference. And we've been encouraging as that is the default for a couple of years. And so we marked it as deprecated in 1.9. We did add a runtime warning saying this is going away, and even provided a code mod to change it. And so we did actually rip that out in 2.0 along with some various other fields. Most of the same build changes. We also have some new features that are coming in 2.0. So one is that like we've never had anything built in to help with lazy loading reducers for code splitting. So say you've got, a very large enterprise style application, and like you only want to load the admin page stuff or like the editing tab or whatever. And you don't want that logic to exist in the store until they add it. There was always like a copy paste recipe that you could use to inject those reducers later, but you had to do all the work yourself. Like it required keeping around references to all the old reducers, because then you had to recombine them plus the new one to make the new root reducer and then swap it out. And there were some other ecosystem packages to try to help with it, but like they're actually all like dead and unmaintained at this point. So a year ago, Lens put out an idea of a hypothetical API that might kind of help with this. And then Ben, Eskimo Joe, just like sat down and wrote this out like 2 or 3 months ago, just like whipped it up. And to be honest, I haven't even had a chance to play with it myself. When I wrote the release notes for this in one of the earlier alphas, I was having to like read the PR and go off the tests to try to figure out how to describe it. But the idea is, number one, you pass in the entire slice object, not just the reducer function. It assumes that slice.name is going to be like the top level state key. So if you said like name to-dos, it's going to assume that's going to be added as state.to-dos. Which was always like, again, it was like the 95% default that most people did anyway. Technically, you could put it anywhere you want to, but most people are just going to use the same key in both places. But the trick is it uses some proxy magic inside so that you don't have to swap out the reducer itself. You just insert the reducer once, and then you can inject more like slice reducers into this top level reducer, and it just works. So you don't have to worry about keeping around the references to the old one. You don't even have to worry about cases where like, was that data loaded or not when I try to read it in a use selector? Like it intelligently falls back to the default value just in case it hasn't been added to the store yet. So it, like, we don't really have good examples of this being used in practice yet because this is just now in the beta, but we think it'll help solve, again, another thing that people have been doing in the ecosystem, but there was never anything built in. We also have expanded Create Slice to do a couple things that a lot of people have asked for. If you were using the Create Async Thunk API, you always had to define those outside of the slice. And then you handled the actions in that extra reducers field, because that was how a slice responded to actions that were defined outside of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked, and there were good reasons for it. But people had always asked us, like, can we define thunks inside of Create Slice? It'll be shorter, it'll be simpler. I don't have to like supply the initial string prefix, etc. And we wanted to do that. The problem is we couldn't get the TypeScript types to work, because you're supposed to get your root state type from the store. The store gets its type from the slices, but thunks can access the root state. So it needs to know that. And then you get this like TypeScript circular inference problem, and it throws errors. And we care about shipping good TypeScript behavior. And we weren't willing to ship a solution that would work badly for TS users.
Gotcha.
So like we get the code to run, but we couldn't figure out a good way to deal with the types. So we kept punting on it. And so we finally settled on a sort of compromise solution a couple months ago. The reducers field, which has always been just an object inside of Create Slice, can now also be like one of those builder callback things, similar to what we did with like RTK query. You're still going to return an object that will have fields like to do added, to do toggle, etc. But you use this builder to make the values for each thing. So you call like create.reducer, create.preparedReducer, or now create.async thunk to say what is the thing at each of those fields. And if you're making a thunk inside of there, the syntax is a little simpler. It assumes some of the types and stuff by default. And I think most of the time people aren't doing like really advanced things with thunks in those cases. So our answer is like, you really need to access get state inside of there. You're going to have to do like a manual cast to root state. And that seems to work around the compile problems. Worst case, like you can still define a thunk outside and do it the way you have been. But if you really want to do it, we've provided something that's hopefully a little bit simpler. And again, like we think that RTK query solves most of the things you would need to write thunks for anyway.
Right.
But it's a thing people have asked for. Similarly, we've always encouraged writing selector functions in the same file. And there was this weird dichotomy where the slice and the reducer don't know where they're going to get added. But when you write the selector in the same file, it's like, oh yeah, it has to be at state.todos in order to access the value. So you have this weird little dichotomy of it doesn't like this doesn't know where it lives, but the selectors have to know where it lives.
Okay.
Same file. So we've now got the ability to define selectors inside of Create Slice. And it again makes a default assumption that it's going to be stored as slice.name. So state.todos or whatever by default. Again, there are limits. Like we don't know what the TS types of the rest of the state will be. So you can't really safely access, state.posts or something from your to-do slice. But filling in some of those default scenarios that people probably want to do. And we've got some other fallback options for like, if it's actually getting added as like, I don't know, state.other to-dos or something, you can pass in a function that retrieves that value first so that the rest of the lookups work okay.
Gotcha.
This is something we're still not 100% sure on the exact final behavior on. We would really like people to try this out in the betas and let us know like, hey, this works great. Or like, I tried to do this other thing and it doesn't let me do it. Or I got an error, needs more options, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
And then we've Redux Toolkit has always depended on and re-exported create selector from the reselect library for making memoized selector functions. We use that inside of RTK query. And a few months ago, I spent some time trying to fiddle with reselect and build out some new features. Reselect is very simple conceptually. It does a bunch of like reference equality checks, and that's simple and it's fast, but it also means there's cases where it has false positives and recalculates results when it didn't need to. The classic example of this is, let's say I'm trying to select state.todos, and the output of a selector maps over that and grabs todo.id. So we have an array of just the IDs. If I dispatch an action that toggles the completed flag, that's going to make a new object at like array index 3. It's going to make a new to-dos array because one of the values inside changed. And it's going to update, root state. If you grab state.todos as the input to a selector, that select to-do IDs function is going to rerun even though none of the IDs changed. And you're going to end up with a new arrays reference with the same ID values inside. And now maybe like your list component re-renders when it really didn't need to.
Right.
And I'd previously added an option that like let you check the output and do another comparison and maybe like skip it and reuse the old one, but it was always a bit of a weakness and a pain point. So the new hotness in the JavaScript world over the last year is signals. Like everybody loves signals. Like just I have a box with a value inside and I assign to it or mutate it, and like everything just magically updates and it just works and it's faster and it's like more targeted. Redux will never be able to use signals. Like we are an immutable based library.
Wait, what?
But
no.
Yeah, I know. But I've been wondering if there was some kind of inspiration or like mixing of the worlds that we could do. And I'd scrolled away some bookmarks of stuff that I'd seen over in the Ember world. And so one of the Ember folks had written a Ember add-on several years back called Tracked Redux, where they took a Redux store and they wrapped it with some of the new functionality from Ember's recent Glimmer rendering API that auto detects nested field updates. And every time the Redux store would update, they would shove the entire Redux state value into like a tree of proxy objects that tracked which fields in the state were being accessed. So if I accessed like state.todos bracket 3.completed, it tracks state to-dos bracket 3 completed, and it knows that that chain of fields is being depended on by somebody. And the next time you put in a new value, it's able to like mark those as changed specifically, and then intelligently determine, oh, like just this one bit of the UI needs to update. So I spent a couple weeks digging through that code and some of the Ember libraries and whatnot. And they had some of those Ember folks had some very good articles on how this auto tracking concept worked. And I was able to copy, paste, modify a lot of that stuff and build a new alternate memoizer for the reselect library that uses this to intelligently determine exactly what fields are being accessed and only recalculate if those specific fields change. And so it has different trade-offs and performance characteristics. There's a number of cases where it would not update at all, and like your selector would recalculate less and your UI would re-render less often. There is more overhead in doing some of those checks. I don't yet know like how much of an impact that has in a real world application. Right. It's also got a couple funny little behaviors, like because it depends on checking nested field accesses. If you write a selector that just like immediately returns the input value, which A is bad, you should never do that, but sometimes people do. It'll think nothing ever changed because it never saw an access to a nested field.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like it'll run the first time and then never again. So I've made this available in Reselect 5 Alpha as an alternate option that you could switch to when making a selector if you think it would benefit from the different performance characteristics. I also made a third option that is based on code I copy pasted from the React library that uses weak maps to look at the arguments. And the idea there is that selectors have always defaulted to having a cache size of 1. Which means if you try to share the same selector function across like many different components that pass in like props.id or something, they're all going to call it with different arguments. And it's always going to recalculate because it's never seen the same arguments twice in a row. So the cache size always gets blown. So I had previously added like a max size option to reselect a couple years ago, but you had to like give it a fixed number ahead of time, like 10 or 100 or something. Because this new approach uses weak maps, it should throw the values away as soon as nothing else depends on that object reference. And so in theory, I think it kind of has like a cache size of infinity and just intelligently gets rid of stuff when it's no longer needed. It's really hard to write tests for that. I was working with a guy named Corbin Crutchley at a hackathon recently to like try to write tests that verify these things go away when stuff gets garbage collected. So these are pieces that feel useful. I don't have examples of them in real world applications, but they seemed worth building, and I hope that they can help solve problems for people.
Cool. Very cool. So that leaves us with about 9 minutes remaining. So is there anything that you want to make sure we cover before I start tearing things down?
Let's hit the three big comparison points that I'd brought up as discussions.
Okay.
So the number one question that we keep getting, and I probably should put this in our FAQ somewhere, is what is the difference between context and Redux, and when should I use either? And like a year and a half, 2 years ago, I wrote what is intended to be like the single definitive answer to this entire topic, which is like a 10,000 word post on my blog. And the answer is context is not a state management tool. It is a dependency injection tool. It's kind of like passing one prop at a distance to any component that cares about it. You're actually, when you manage the management is actually done by you in whatever use state or use reducer or use memo or whatever. You're the one who is deciding what goes into the top of the context. That's the management part. Context is just a way to pass it down. Redux, on the other hand, is a state management library. It's meant to work outside of React. It's meant to work with React. The management is the store, the reducers, the actions. If you put use reducer and use context together, they do start to resemble React and Redux and React Redux. There are a number of technical differences in both behavior and implementation. Use reducer and use context are limited to only working inside the React component tree. And there is currently no way to selectively re-render when part of the value in the context changes. You're only putting in one value. It could be a primitive, it could be an object, it could be like a client fetching instance thing, but one value goes in, and every time you put a new reference into context provider.value, every component that reads from that will re-render, even if they only care about value.b and value.a got updated. Whereas React Redux lets you be more specific about which values you're extracting from the state. And it's got, the dev tools and middleware and the ability to write all this logic outside of React. So use context and user reducer are great tools. You should use them a lot. I'm like, this is not an argument saying Redux is better or that you must use Redux. What I am saying is these are different tools with different trade-offs and different use cases. And you should understand those differences so you can make an intelligent decision about which tool best fits your current problem.
Great.
Not that I've repeated that like 5,000 times before.
Did you want to? I think you had one other one that you were going to talk about.
Well, couple others real fast. So on the side effects thing, like I said, we shipped the RTK listener middleware last year, and so our recommendation at this point is that you should use RTK query for data fetching as if the default approach for data fetching in your application. It does all this stuff out of the box. It does all the caching and has the hooks for you. You really should not write data fetching code by hand, either in a Redux application or a React application. So use RTK query for the default. If you need to write reactive logic, this action got dispatched, kick something off, use the RTK listener middleware as the default approach for that. It does almost everything that you could do with sagas and observables. It's simpler, it's smaller, easier to use, better TypeScript support, and it's a lot easier to work with. There are probably a very few cases where sagas have some very complex option that listeners don't, and you might have to fall back for that. But we really did design listeners to do almost everything that sagas could. So if you need to write reactive logic, prefer this. And then the last question is, what about React query versus RTK query? This is not a competition. We love React query. We love the React query maintainers. Tanner Linsry's great. I finally got to meet Dominic Dorfmeister, the current React query maintainer, at React Summit last week. And in fact, Lens and I had dinner with Dominic, and people were taking pictures and saying like, oh, they're like conspiring about the future of like client-side data fetching in React. We actually cross-endorse each other's libraries. Like if you're writing a plain React app, you should use React query. If you're writing a Redux app, you should use RTK query. They are the same kind of tool. They solve the same kind of problem. There are differences in some of the APIs and capabilities. React query is more like, let's define the fetching function at the place where we make the request. RTK query is more like, let's define all the endpoints up front so that like we can use code generation and TypeScript and generate the hooks and all that kind of stuff. But they are fundamentally the same kind of tool with roughly the same set of capabilities. So use one or the other, depending on like what kind of app you're building. But this is not a competition in terms of like we dislike each other. They're both great tools. In fact, like I'm hopeful that like I finally got to meet Michelle Westrate, author of MobX and Immer. And afterwards, we were talking about like maybe at a conference in a few months, we can do like a talk or a panel about like competing library maintainers and how we actually like pretty much get along and love each other and like take inspiration from each other. So maybe we'll get to do that at like React Advanced or something in the fall.
Very cool.
So
right, that, unfortunately, we are out of time, so I gotta end this here. So everybody, if you want to have more questions, if you want to get direct into something with Mark, you can go find on Twitter, on GitHub, on all the places. Just remember, be kind. And then we also want to do a shout out to the sponsors. We've had live captioning on this episode like we do on every episode, and that's made possible through the support of Netlify, NX, New Relic, and Pluralsight, who all kick in to make this show more accessible and allow us to do all the fun shenanigans that we do. Make sure you go check out the schedule. We've got so much good stuff going on. And thank you to Ashley from White Coat Captioning for doing the captioning today. With that, Mark, I think we are all set. Do you have any final words before I send us off to go raid?
Please use RTK. If you're not using already, please try out the betas and let us know how they work. Give us feedback on what breaks or what we should try to tweak. Day job plug, check out replay.io. If you haven't seen it yet, it will drastically simplify your debugging. And please don't yell at maintainers.
I'm going to drop a link to the time travel episode here. And then we're going to go and raid Martine Dowden. So everybody stay tuned for that, and we will see you all next time. Thank you so much.